Talmud in 90 minutes. Imagine if Martians landed here on Earth and said, tell me all your wisdom. I want to know all of science in 90 minutes. Tomorrow, I want in 90 minutes all of literature, not just Western literature, all of literature. I feel that way with all of art in 90 minutes. What are you going to say? So I feel that way with the Talmud. That's foolhardy to try to give an overview of the Talmud in 90 minutes, even what it is. But we're very brave or foolhardy, one of the two. So we're going to do it. So the Talmud is the portable homeland of the Jewish people. The Talmud is the oral Torah become a book. The teachings of Moses down through the generations of the sages and how it developed, it becomes the center of Jewish life. I want to share a few thoughts about how sometimes the academic approach to looking at the Talmud is very different than the traditional approach. In universities today, when they study Talmud, they're looking for the different layers. Since the Talmud was created from the period 100 BC to 500, the Common Era, they look for different layers and levels, how it came about. They are excavating a fossil. They're digging for they're finding this fossil. They want to know, what did it eat? They look at its digestive system. They try to figure out where it lived, why it died. When a Jew reads Talmud, he's reading a living, breathing thing, the heart of Judaism. Everything flows from it. Every text that comes after the Talmud is looking backwards to the Talmud for inspiration, and the Tanakh, and for direction. Everything has to be. It's a living thing because it also guides all decision-making in Jewish law of future times. Even though we're going to see how codes develop and it really snowballs in a way, nevertheless, it is always looking backwards to the Talmud. And what we hope to see the central nature of that as well. Shalom Ovchenkos. Do we get both or one? Wonderful. Good. So we are to take a look here. Let's see what we can do here. Okay. So we're going to look at the Talmud. If you have your timeline, the timeline will be important. It's in your book. Let's see if I have one here. Okay, but it's on the screen too. The shaded box that is over the colored lines is the period of the Talmud that we're looking at. So the Talmud is going to be composed by sages. I'll pass one down your way. Composed by sages that lived from 100 approximately to 500 of the Common Era. Here, do you need one? Here, pass one down. Here you go. We got one. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Yes. So, now the writing of it, there's two sections of the Talmud, is what we're going to discover. The Talmud is made up of two separate works. So let's take a quick look here for a moment. In your line, you have the orange line. The Talmud becomes closed as a canon. First, the Mishnah is closed in the year 200, which we'll talk about what it is. Then the Talmud is closed in about the year 500, with editing going on probably till the year 600. And the Talmud is a large work. This is one volume of the Talmud. There are 63 tractates. Some of these books will hold two or three tractates. But the Talmud itself is in the center of this book, the center column. We're going to see in a minute. I'll put up on the screen. I'll also pass out some handouts shortly. But this is the center. The center column is the Talmud. Around it are commentaries. In the back, there are commentaries too. Sometimes about 100 different commentaries. We're going to discover why these things are not redundant and why they are, so to speak, adding to the edifice of Judaism that is the Talmud, which is going to be, we're going to try to divide the class into two. First half, the history of it. The second half, we're going to actually try to do some Talmudic study, and I'm trying to make it as close to the original experience as possible. So I'll have a bunch of yeshiva boys come in here and start shouting at each other. Okay. All right. After the Tanakh, after the 24 books, there's no other book as central to Judaism as the Talmud. The Tanakh is woven into the Talmud as well. It's quoted all the time. Most of study in traditional circles has become the Talmud. We will talk about some subtle differences between Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jewry, two great strands of the development of Jewry from the year 1000 until today. But in general, the Talmud is the central heartbeat of everything. How they use it and how they interact with it were some slight differences that are interesting from a historical point of view, and helps us also understand how Jewish law developed a little bit differently in different communities, which was one of the topics we started talking about. Okay, so this is the page of the Talmud. The page of the Talmud, the center, you have the Mishnah. The Mishnah is where, right, the gap in the lines, that's the Mishnah. Now, there are 6 tractates of the Mishnah, 6 orders of the Mishnah, 63 tractates, each one with about 8 to 10 chapters. Each of them have about 8 to 10 Mishnahs, about 5,000 Mishnahs, which are paragraphs of law that were written very succinctly, and we're going to discuss how and why they were created. Compilation, 63 tractates, records the teachings, discussions, deliberations of hundreds of sages, has dozens of commentaries that explain it and discuss it. This is the Talmud. Now, despite the fact the Talmud gives the most advanced student a tremendous amount of ability to delve deeper, there's also a portal that we can enter and study it on the first levels of learning. In other words, this is something that, a non-Jew came to Warsaw in the interwar period, and he was describing as he visited the Jewish quarter, which most of Warsaw was Jewish, and he sees all these horse and buggies parked outside one synagogue. And he says, "What is this?" He said, "This is the wagon driver synagogue." Every group of these guilds had their own synagogue where he poked his head in. They're studying Talmud. They're studying the stories of the Talmud. That's like a little bit easier. The stories are more inspiring, less headbutting, as we're going to see. Like the Agadah, the Medrash that we discussed last week, or Agadah is how it's called in the Talmud, or Ein Yaakov is a work that we're going to encounter of the stories. But the point is, this is what Jews did. They studied Talmud. And it didn't matter what level of learning you were at, you were able to learn at a certain level. Okay, so the layout of the page is in our book. I think it's page, let's take a look. It is page 96. So 96, you see the layout of the page. Now, there's 2 types of commentaries in general on the Talmud, and this will help us as we go through this. There are commentaries that come to tell you how to make sense of the text. Then there are commentaries that are codifying. They're going to try to derive the law from the text. These are 2 different fields of endeavor. They are not the same thing. A codifier wants to know the conclusion. He wants to figure out what is the end result of behavior to codify. What we're focusing on today is not the codes. The codes are a different breed. Those are connected to Jewish law. The Talmud, although it's a source of Jewish law, is also studied for its own right to understand the logic and reasoning of each party and where it comes from and the underlying principles that are in each section of it. So the commentaries and super commentaries are what we are going to focus on today. It will have ramification for law as well, of course. One of the great challenges of studying the Talmud is going to be, we'll cover that in a moment. Okay, so the center of the page has a Talmudic text. Surrounding sections are its numerous commentaries. So here is in English. Let me pass this around. If you would take one of these, doctor, and then pass around the rest. Yeah, take one and pass around. And you notice I'm going to give you something else to take and pass around. It should, like ships in the night. Here we go. Okay, I'm passing you a handout. These are different sheets, so everyone should have one. These are different, they make their way around. We're passing out 2 different sheets. The first sheet is set up in the form of a Talmud, If you don't mind, yes, thank you. Take that. These are different ones, right? So it's set up in this sheet. It's set up. Yeah, take those and pass them to the left. Beautiful. It's set up in the order of the Talmud just to show you what it is. So if you don't mind, Elias, after your wife, she has an extra one of the other type.
When you
Yes.
say 63 tractates.
Yes.
Is that a tractate?
That's the tractate.
63 volumes like that?
Well, some of them are 2 or 3 in one volume, so it's like 22 volumes
Okay.
in of this size. Or if you could take one of those and pass it around. So we have here is, and this is a little bit entertaining, if you will. This is in English, a layout of Talmudic page, but telling you who the people are. Rashi is who we need to guide us through the thicket. Without Rashi, we're going to see when we study the text today, it'll be very difficult for us to make sense of it. Aramaic is not a spoken language today. As a matter of fact, Aramaic stopped being a spoken language in the time period of when the Talmud was composed. So what happened was people then were living in Iraq and they had to sometimes find out what words meant because people weren't speaking it anymore. Arabic becomes the language. Aramaic is of the Aramean people, which were an ancient people. There still are some Kurds today that speak it, or Arameans that speak it. I have a friend in Turkey, the Chabad rabbi there, that he had to travel throughout when the country was closed down. He had to travel throughout the country for kosher supervision because none of the Israeli supervisors came in. So he went all over to these biblical sites because he had to go to kosher supervision. But he met all different types of people. So he's speaking in Aramaic to this Aramean what do you call it again? Muslim clergy. I don't remember what exactly he was over there. The point was Kurds or Arameans, they speak this language. And this guy's like, I'm able to sing Chad Gadya, which is in Aramaic, this little goat that we read up, the people sing on Pesach. Exactly, it's Aramaic. See, you know Aramaic already. And this guy knew Aramaic too. He said, I finally sing when someone knows what the words mean. What were you going to say, Doctor?
Yeah, and then I guess at that time of writing, first of all, I heard there are two different.
We're going to get to that exactly.
Okay, so one is from
Israel,
Babylon, and the other is
Israel,
Babui, right? And the
right.
other is so we're talking about both of them being written in Aramaic.
Yes, both in Aramaic with slightly different dialects. Because Aramaic was the language of the time. Everywhere. Aramaic was the language. Franca. That's what it was. Now the Mishnah is written in Hebrew. The Mishnah, which is in the land of Israel, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, as we're going to encounter, is written in Hebrew with some Greek words, but it's Hebrew. It's rabbinic Hebrew. It is evolved from biblical Hebrew, but it's directly related. Our prayer book uses our Hebrew. The prayer book is more Mishnaic Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew than biblical Hebrew, although we will use biblical verses, but someone who knows Hebrew can see that the construction and the grammar will be a little bit different, more Mishnaic Hebrew than biblical Hebrew. So is a direct line. We're going to get to that as well. Okay, so this is just the layout of the page. Keep this as a souvenir. It'll help you. We're not going to cover all of everything, but we're taking this big picture, bird's eye view. So Judaism is a constant learning process. The greater part of Jewish learning has been the study of the Talmud. It's not just a book, it's much more because it doesn't just have law. It also leads to all the different areas, but also because all the commentaries are linked to it, it creates this organic whole. But also how you teach yourself and your children Talmud is to analyze every side of an argument, to see every side and understand the perspective of where the questioner and the answerer and everyone is coming from. So there's a whole way of looking at the world, very analytical, that becomes part of the Jewish tradition. But also, of course, as was brought before by Marty, is that everything matters, that every detail matters of life, of what we do. Okay, so what's unique about the Talmud? So it is the most, we spoke about Midrash last week, which is oral traditions, let's say about stories, or interpretations of the Bible, even about Jewish law. All those things are part of the oral tradition. But the Mishnah becomes the work. Why? What happened? What happens like this? Very big overview. from the time of Moses and on, there were courts, the rabbinic courts. Whenever there was a debate, you would go to the rabbinic court. Now you had regional courts, and then you had the high court. This was both in the desert and ultimately in Israel. When they come to Israel, they have these regional courts and high courts. The way it would work was if you had a problem, a question, the Torah said last week, we read about it, you should go to the judge in your time, go to the Levite in your time, which meant in the temple. But there were judges in these other towns. How did that work? You came to the judges, court of 23 for capital crime, a court of 3 for monetary issues, and you presented your case. If they had a tradition, which means from Moses, or an interpretation from a high court that existed before in their books of law, whether oral tradition or their own notes, they said, we have a tradition, this is the law. If they did not have a tradition, they would send the plaintiffs, the defendant, they would go to the court in Jerusalem. And there were different courts there. You could make your way all the way to the high court. Basically, the high court was only ones that were allowed to make an interpretation from the biblical text and extract a new law. That's how it was done. So you know what went on for a long time? There were no arguments in Judaism. Judaism was not going to fragment because there were no new laws coming that were not coming from the central court. There was no autonomy for the separate courts or for the separate tribes of Judaism. It was one central court. Yes, doctor.
So what about the king? We have the stories of Solomon, Shlomo,
So
pronouncing judgments on various matters.
very good. There is together in Judaism with rabbinic law, there's also something called the king's law. There are 3 branches of government in Judaism. You have the king, who has a law mostly connected to war and taxes. And then you have the rabbinic and keeping public order possibly. Then you have the rabbinic court system. And then you would have the prophet, who is the moral voice. So there are sometimes conflict between the law of the king, but in general, we're not talking about that. That's mostly war and politics. It is possible, like King David, he had a rabbinic court as well that he was part of, that he judged as part of the court, not as king. So Solomon, you could also go to an individual, to any individual, and say, can you judge me? And Solomon was wise. So there, that court would not be him deciding by fiat. It was rather him deciding either as an arbitrator or as part of a court. He's talking about a capital story over there, capital crime of killing the baby or trying to take the baby, whatever the different elements of the story were. But anyway, the point is, very quickly, just to overview so I don't go too far afield. You could have an arbitrator, anyone could do that as long as both people agree to be subservient to the decision. You can go to anybody you want, like Devorah, who was a prophetess and also a judge, even though she wouldn't have been able to sit on the high court necessarily. Then you can have a king, as rules of politics or of war and things like that. And then the traditional rabbinic courts, rabbinical system that we're talking about here. So the way it would work was from the time of Moses.
You said that the judgments and the rulings of the old high court were written down.
So they were allowed to write for themselves. They had their own scrolls, notes. It was transmitted orally, but the prophets and the courts would write for themselves notes. There was traditions. We don't have those texts. We don't have those books. They weren't allowed to be published. These were shorthand for themselves that were transmitted. Now, the way it worked with the courts from Moses and on, at 70 elders, you read about in the Torah, when one would die, a new one would be replaced. So there was a mentorship program going on here, and it was an unbroken chain of elders. The 70 elders, as one died, new one came in. One died, new one came in. But not with 5, not with 7, not with expanded 14, with 70. So with 70 means the vast majority of people always going to be much more experienced than the newbies, and the traditions continue. What happens is with the Jewish expulsion after the destruction of the first temple to Babylon, and then later on the Persian kings take over, there's a hiatus of this whole system. When they come back, they make the men of the Great Assembly, which is 120 men. You read in the book of Nehemiah about 85 leaders are signing on to this new covenant with God, reestablishing the people. And the Talmud tells us there were also 35 prophets among them, a few different versions of how many prophets. There's 120 people making the second Commonwealth. They become a high court, not 70, which is not normal. All the historians struggle with why 120. the Knesset today is a model of that. They picked 120. But the 120 of the rabbinic court of the Second Temple period were the ones that established rabbinic law that we consider daily prayer, the formation of the prayer, formation of blessings, and many other things like that. As they died, they stopped at 70, and they kept on adding to get 70 again. The 120, one of the theories is, no, it's good, it's good. One of the theories, it allows the, it's as good, part of it. One of the theories that to me resonate, but it's just a theory, and for a class like this, it's really not smart to bring in theories because there are enough facts. But one theory is that because they were starting a whole new system without that tradition of the 70 sages anymore, in other words, there were people that were still ordained and as judges by their teachers that came before them in that unbroken chain from Moses. Ordained they hadn't sat as a court. So they were afraid if you come and you make a court and we don't include every single great rabbi and great teacher, you're going to end up with a center of power outside of the court that could end up disagreeing with the majority opinion and aligning with the minority opinion, and then you would have a schism. So they brought everybody in for the first time. But otherwise, the courts are supposed to be 70. We don't know why 120. That's just a theory that I just said. I'm making sure that caveat is clear. It's a theory, and everyone bangs their head and come up with all sorts of creative ideas. But one thing we do know, after that it becomes 70. And when it becomes 70, and I want to hear what Dr. Chen will say in a moment, when it becomes 70, so that court exists until the middle of the period of the Second Temple, when there are problems, when these courts, after the story of the Maccabees and others, you find for the first time names of people with arguments. It wasn't that Jews didn't know how to argue before. Moses said the Jews are always arguing, what's going on? But there was a high court that solved everything, and there was no minority opinion that was ever published. We didn't believe in that. So what happens is it's only when the high court is no longer meeting all the time for different reasons, not always in the same place, they're back and forth, not all the sages are present, they can't deal with every issue, that you begin to have arguments that are not resolved. And that begins to snowball to the point where the houses of Shammai and Hillel in the period before the destruction of the Second Temple, where it seemed like Judaism was going to become two Judaisms. Why? Because these people were not meeting in one court all the time to resolve their differences. The schools develop on their own. Sometimes they would come together and vote. And when the majority was like Hillel, the law was like Hillel. There's a crazy story in the Talmud where at one point, Shammai was able to get the majority. They blocked the doors from the students that they felt were not good enough from Hillel's camp. And they became the majority, and they were able to pass through 13 laws that day, like Shammai. And it was almost like a usurping of the powers. But what happened was, if Hillel didn't want, Hillel's school didn't have to sit in that court. They could have said, okay, we're not sitting, so to speak. They sat, despite the fact that they were a minority, and they were overruled. But the point is, what happens in Judaism is happening by the time of Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, is that you have these different schools that were developing. And Maimonides points out that when it was a settled time and people were able to converse and study well, and they served their teachers properly, using the same biblical principles, people would come up with closer, more agreements. It is when you become more fragmented and people are not studying as well as they should have, is what Maimonides says, that the differences grow. Shammai and Hillel only have 3 or 4 differences in the Talmud. Their students have many, many more. So we say this fragmentation was happening. And I'll come back to what else was going on at that time. What were you going to say, Doctor?
I was gonna, so with both 120 and 70, it's an even number, and you said that
There would have to be one other, 71. Moses, it was 70 plus 1. It'd always have to be one.
You need to somehow break the.
Right, you always 70 elders, and Moses was number 1, 71.
And
right.
After that,
So
it
was always 71.
Somebody who would break the.
It had to be.
Yeah.
It had to be. But if someone says, I don't know, or whatever it is, and the things that we can't resolve, that happened too at a certain point in this history that we're talking about. So going back for a second, what's happening here in Judaism, though, Judaism is also fragmented. You have what we call minim. People would translate it as heretics. Let's say that early Christianity. You have the Sadducees. You have the Dead Sea Scroll people, the Essenes, or whatever they were. Karaites are much later, a little bit later, but they're similar to Sadducees. Sometimes in rabbinic literature they conflate the two, but that happens later in like the year 800, the Karaites. But before that, in the end of the Second Temple period, things are breaking off, and there's a danger. So what was going on? Each school, the rabbis had begun to organize. Because they saw what was happening, they had organized their teachings for their students, because you were allowed to write down notes for yourself, and a student could share the crib notes, but you weren't allowed to publish, so to speak, only the Tanakh. What happens is Rabbi Yehuda the Prince says, let's get together, let us create a work that will take in all the different opinions. Now, some of these schools, it seems like that they would write their own interpretations of the Torah, but they wouldn't write other people's minority opinions. For example, Hillel's school was unique because whenever they had an argument with the house of Shammai, they would write down Shammai's opinion first, and then they would write down theirs. So they were one of these people, uniquely humble, that we end up determining the law like them much of the time when there's a debate, most of the time. But Yehuda the Prince did the same thing. He took all the different oral traditions, all the different rulings of the courts that went before, been going on for 1,000 years, 1,500 years. He takes all that stuff and he creates 6 orders, 63 tractates, all meant to be memorized. And it shouldn't sound strange to you because in the time period of the Talmud, everyone memorized the Mishnah. They knew the Mishnah by heart, most of them. Some say certain orders they didn't always know by heart, but in general, they knew this. And there are kids today, I know, who study the Mishnah by heart, the whole Mishnah, not just a tractate. When we were kids in camp, that was like the contest, who could study and give prizes and all that. It's called Mishnayos by heart. The reason is the oral tradition stays oral. Even Maimonides, 1,000 years ago, he writes his 1,000 chapters, and in his introduction, he says, this way everyone will know it by heart. What was he assuming? There were people that memorized these things. That's how people learn. And you're going to discover it with God's help. We'll discover why it's important to have all the information at your fingertips, because everything is hyperlinked. This book is called a Masechta, or properly a Meseches, a tractate, which literally means a weaving or a web, because the first World Wide Web was the Talmud. Everything is hyperlinked. All the different concepts that are woven together ultimately are linked to other tractates too. One idea is going to have ramifications from many, many other sources. You have to have all these ideas at your fingertips to be able to have a meaningful discussion about these issues. That is one of the great challenges of determining Jewish law. Yes, doctor.
So with that in mind, if you start reading it, there may not be a particular order because you can start reading anywhere, and then you go to using these links to other places.
Correct. The issue is like this, though, is that they would study, that's called a sugya. A sugya is called a subject matter, which may be in a few different tractates. So there were people that were proficient in different tractates, and they were experts in certain fields, and others were experts in other fields. But in general, the way it would work in Babylon, after the Talmud was finished, in the period 500 to 1,000, they would study certain tractates for each semester. Each semester had different tractates, and people would go home and study on their own, and then they would come and they would discuss. So there was a whole system. Yes?
Did the minority opinions get noted somewhere?
Correct. Very good. The Mishnah is unique. Till the Mishnah, minority opinions, when there was a high court, minority opinions disappeared into ether.
They were gone.
They were gone. We didn't want them because it was going to create a fragmented Judaism. Once there was a fragmented Judaism, we need the minority opinion for 2 opposite reasons. We have to know what was rejected, but we also have to know what their opinions were, because there may be certain cases where a court would be able to use some of their approaches. In other words, things could change in certain ways, which is a little more subtle. But a simple one was you would know what was rejected, which is important. But not just that, what we could begin to understand when we ultimately we analyze everything. We get to understand the logic and reasoning behind even the minority opinions. But also where they're coming from. And we're going to see an example of where ideas in disparate places matter. They come together to give us an understanding of a subject. Okay, let's take a little bit further. So Yehuda the prince goes and organizes Mishnah with his very clear language, beautiful Hebrew. Okay, but because the oral Torah is about our partnership, the Talmud is really an expression of this. As first you have the Mishnah as almost a received tradition, but then we're going to analyze and take it apart, and we're going to go in a few different directions. There are two parts of the Mishnah. Two parts. The Mishnah composed the end of the 2nd century, and then we have it's the first officially recorded summary of the oral Torah, and then the Gemara, the section called the Gemara, is completed at the end of the 5th century. Okay, so it's structured as discussions on the Mishnah with additional teachings. So the history of the oral Torah prior to the Mishnah, there's a 500-year gap after the written Torah before anything's written down. The Sanhedrin's role, the final authority in all questions of Torah law, and as we said, the way Maimonides reads the story was that they were the ones that were qualified and authorized to make, derive from the biblical text new laws, and only them, which we'll get to. The 6 orders of the Mishnah cover a wide range of subjects. What's not in the Mishnah, since its purpose was to preserve the oral Torah, so it's written very concisely, and we're going to take a look at that as well. Many laws are inferred. If you have to remember it and memorize it, it has to be, you can't have everything, you have to have everything that can be unpacked from these cliff notes, if you will. So everything has to be there, but in miniature, and only includes rulings and discussions up to his time, and also things that were no longer, things that everybody knew that was common, maybe wasn't covered. Like one of the big debates is, why is Hanukkah not mentioned as a whole tractate? It's mentioned twice in the Talmud, like off the cuff, in the Mishnah. Not the Talmud discusses it more in the Mishnah, but there are things they say just happened. It was recent history. There was less of a need to put it in the Mishnah. But there's different opinions about that. Okay, what's the Gemara part? So the Mishnah of the teaching of Yehuda the prince. The Gemara is the discussions and analysis of it. So both Jerusalem and Babylonia, and the 300 years following Mishnah's compilation. What happens is there are Jews in Israel, Jews in Babylon. The Jews in Babylon, Jews have been in Babylon from the first temple period. Temple was destroyed, Jews were in Babylon, everyone was in Babylon. Persians take over, then the Jews go back about 450 BC to Israel. But only 50,000 go back. The vast majority is still in Babylon. What they're doing exactly, we don't know. But they have the Torah because they never lose it. And they're continuing huge, the majority of the community is there. Slowly people come back to Israel. In Israel, Judaism is developing, and in Babylon, Judaism is developing, and there's communications between the two. They travel to the west, to the east, they're going back and forth. In Jerusalem, what happens is when the Byzantine Empire takes over the Romans in about the year 350, 310, but by 350, it's unbearable for the Jews because it's become a Christian country. And because he became Constantine becomes the church of the East, and Israel's under their domain. So what happens is the Jerusalem Talmud is finished. We're going to talk about difference in style and technique as well. But Jerusalem Talmud is done, 350. Many of the rabbis come down to Babylon, so they the Babylonian Talmud folds into it many of the opinions of the Jerusalem Talmud. So the Babylonian Talmud becomes the Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud is not studied in depth by many for much of Jewish history. There's been periods where some have been much more into it than others, but because the Babylonian Talmud is the final word, and the whole point here is the final word, the Talmud becomes the final word for Judaism. Although today we have autonomy, a rabbi can decide Jewish law on his own, he has to go back to the Talmud. In practice, he usually doesn't go back that far because there is a hierarchy as well. Every 500 years has been a different period of authority in Judaism. So from the Talmud in the year 500, then begins a period called the Gaonic period from 500 to 1,000. They're in a second level of authority. Then the early codifiers from 1,000 to 1,500, and then 1,500 till today is another level. But the point is, the only work that was accepted by all Jews since the close of the Sanhedrin has become the Talmud. So the Talmud is not, though, strictly a book of law. It's a repository of discussions about Jewish law. So you have to use the Talmud as a toolbox to derive Jewish law. It's also used as a toolbox for Jewish philosophy. But Jewish philosophy and Jewish ethics and all that will dig into the Talmud and create a way of looking at the world. The rabbis did not look for a conclusion when it came to ethics and biblical interpretation or stories and spirituality in the Talmud. They did look for conclusions about Jewish law. So Jewish law is much easier, so to speak, to derive a conclusion from the Talmud. When I say easier, I don't mean simpler. I mean to say it's a more clear path because people agree on the methodology of how you derive. The question becomes what weight you give to different opinions at times, and also, are you looking at every angle? This is going to be the next class when we talk about Jewish law. Yes, doctor.
So, a couple of questions. One is related to the difference between Mishnah and Gemara, and you said that there are opinions, whereas Mishnah is a kind of recording of oral Torah, where opinions may not be that.
Reasons for opinions are not there. It's just said as a fait accompli.
It's a fact, and then opinions would be in the Gemara, I guess.
You know, there'll be differing opinions of the Mishnah, the minority opinion, the majority, but it won't give the reasons for the law, the sources for the law, the application of the law. The Talmud is going to look in three directions. Laterally, it's going to look forwards and backwards. That's what we're going to see. In other words, it's going to look for sources backwards. It's going to look forward for application, but it's also going to look for the literature that existed together with the Mishnah, like halachic midrash. When Rabbi Yehuda the Prince wrote his work, there were books that ended up on the cutting floor. Laws, they're called brises, they're the external. Or other books that were written after Rabbi Yehuda the Prince of the same time period of teachings of the sages, Tosefta. So you have these different works that have secondary value that the Talmud is going to quote as to prove laws and its application sources. So how you take it forward, how you apply it, and what's the underlying principle, what's the logic. And again, I have to say this, I know this is, I'm getting ahead of myself, but to be a real Talmudist, the struggle is like this. The only way you can apply the law to future cases is if you understand the underlying logic. The problem is the only way you can understand the underlying logic is if you know all the different laws that exist in the Talmud. In other words, you can't understand the underlying logic because you can't craft a consistent system unless you know all of it. What we're going to do is we're going to explore one little sliver today where you'll see how the logic and reason is going to help us apply law. So you need to have both elements going on at play. The Talmud is discussion, debate, everything but the kitchen sink, but it's also a web that links pieces to each other so that people wouldn't forget. So you have stories, medicine, science, philosophy, and then they come back to the law. But we treat all that stuff as non-legal as different. It is rich, it's beautiful, it's in the Talmud, so it has a level of authority compared to all the other stories that we tell, but it doesn't have legal in general authority, although we're going to discover today a midrash, a story that has practical behavior that we all follow today. Okay, were you going to say something, Jonathan? Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
But why did they go with the Babylonians and not the Israel?
Because Israel in the year 3 with two reasons. The second reason we'll get to at the end of the class, but in the year 350, the Jerusalem Talmud stopped because of persecution. People fled.
Wait, what you?
In the year 350, the Jews, most of the rabbis and sages and Jews left Israel because of Christian persecution, Roman and Byzantine. Because the Byzantine, which was Turkey, which is Turkey today, ruled Israel, and that Constantine took over. But the Romans were persecuting the Jews anyway. The Parthians were the ones running Iraq, which were in that period, we got along with them fine. That's in the Talmudic period. The Mishnah, there was a window of very good relations between either Marcus Aurelius or Marcus Antoninus, the different opinions who he was, with Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. Rabbi Yehuda the Prince was buddy with him. They were buddy. They were nursed together. They were raised together, and they had good friendship, and that allowed him the freedom of creating this type of work to save Judaism before it would have fragmented
Like the earliest one to build a third temple. too.
So there's a few people at different times, the Justine, after the Byzantine, they tried to rebuild. There's been a couple of stories like that. Fascinating. All right, so the Mishnah goes in three directions. Here's the laterally, backward. Now, if you have any other questions, please forward. This is helpful for me. Okay, what are the three directions of the Mishnaic method? Number one is laterally. You analyze the Mishnah and you compare it with parallel teachings. There are other teachings from other sources not in the Mishnah. Midrash, Brisa, Tosefta, these are works written either before or in that time, a little bit later than the Mishnah, that the Talmud is analyzing. Okay? Then it's going to backwards. Where do we know this from? Manani Mili, where do we know? And what are the underlying principles? Either it's logic, reason, interpretation, or biblical source. The third one is, can I derive additional cases and circumstances? Yes, doctor.
Right at this point, a good point. So, if it's coming from specific people, you can always challenge that to some degree. So the source, the reason it's not challenged, generally speaking, everybody agrees that we should follow that, is that it ultimately goes into the oral Torah, and that would be in the Mishnah, and that provides the ultimate.
It doesn't, because the Mishnah has differing opinions as the majority and minority.
So why would today we not challenge some of that if it's based on just people expressing, very wise people, but still people expressing certain opinions?
Right, because once it was like a high court, it was seen as a high court. That this period is the in theory, if you had a high court, the Messiah would come. The Messiah would come today, and you had a high court, and you would put on it Solomon, Elijah, Moses. They would be able to, using their logic, they wouldn't be able to get rid of any traditions from Moses, because Torah was given once at Sinai. Even Moses can't overrule that. If they would come back, and they would be greater in wisdom and number than the sages of that time, they could revisit everything. We don't have a high court. Judaism has been fundamentally changed with the close of the Talmud. There's never been a consensus that every Jewish community has agreed on since then. We'll talk about the Code of Jewish Law later on tomorrow. The point is, at that moment, Mishnah and Talmud, when it closes, it was accepted by all the Jewry as a repository of this information. But it's not really a book of law, because many a time we'll have debate today about what the law is from the text. As we're going to see with God's help today, that we're going to see certain behavior that is not necessarily you could derive from the Talmud, but there are different approaches to what the law will be. So the text becomes sacred, but it's not final law. It is the final repository of all legitimate opinions and interpretations. And there are systems for deriving who is rejected. We know Shammai is always rejected, except in a number of cases. Abaya, Rava, Rav, Shmuel, there are rules for much of it. But there are other times when you have 5 generations of people arguing about different things. But the new case takes a little bit from each one, so you don't know which one gets more power. That's what we're going to discuss. Okay, so beyond the Mishnah, the Gemara begins with commentary Mishnah and extends to related topics. Okay, I'm going to do 5 more minutes of history, and then I want to do the actual learning to put our minds to work here. So the end of an era. This was the question Dr. Levchenko asked. It was the last time the Jewish people accepted one central authority before dispersion led to many centers of Torah leadership. So you have to go back to the Talmud. There is no way to do Jewish law. And even in the time of the Talmud, I kind of want to go on a tangent, but basically, then you have these different schools. But if they sat with a Sanhedrin, they would have come to a conclusion. So in a way, it is weaker than a high court. High court, it was done. Until you have another high court that rules over it, it will be simple. What happened here, this is a level less than high court, but still everyone had accepted it. A high court would mean the conclusion. Now we don't have a conclusion. We have the legitimate opinions. So if you want to find a legitimacy in Jewish law, what we're going to discover is the way Talmud has been discussed and learned for the last 500 years is through the prism of the rabbis that were from the year 500 to 1,000 and 1,000 to 1,500. Because each of these periods, this is self-imposed, and this is important. In theory, one could argue today with any rabbi leading up to the Talmud. In practice, that would not just be hubris, it would be insanity, because once one understands and sees how Maimonides, how Yosef Karo, how these great codifiers developed Jewish law, you understand that you could pick a side, you can't make your own side. That's how traditional Judaism works, even though technically you could go back to the Talmud. And this would be a debate maybe among people who wanted to change Judaism, but to go back beyond the Talmud, in other words, to overturn the Talmud, there isn't room for that in any of our last 1,500 years. There is room for going back and picking opinions of not because subjectively, but because of an interpretation of law that exists from there on. So my point is, you have a Talmud, you have these things that grow around it with differing levels of authority. When we talk about Jewish law, we'll get to these levels of authority and why they get authority. But the only universal level of authority, and I'm repeating myself, is the Talmud, based on the Mishnah. Okay, so the end of the era, this makes the big difference. The two Talmuds is the Jerusalem Talmud from 200 to 350, and they were living in the place of the Mishnah. And then the Babylonian, they finished about 500. What's the difference between the two? So the Babylonian is more definitive. The persecution was during the Roman Empire, but then it was the Byzantine Empire afterwards that really closed it up. So the Parthians had a lot, the Jews had much more independence and autonomy. So what's the difference between the two texts? This is not so important for our class because the Jerusalem Talmud really was outside of the discussion for much of development of Jewish law. It would come in and out, but it wasn't always a central figure in the decision-making of Jewish law. But either way, the difference is, historically, Jerusalem Talmud took a direct approach, less give and take, less debate. It would say the law and the interpretation of the law, done, very little deliberation. The Talmudic is much more winding approach. You have an hypothesis, you have a rejection, you have an assumption. So we say it's like the Jerusalem Talmud is like a lit room, but the Babylonian Talmud is like looking in a dark room. We're feeling everything. What is this exactly? Wait, what is this? But by doing that, the paradox of life is I'm groping and I have to define what this is. And as I cut my fingers on the edges of a seltzer can, I have a better understanding of the contours of the seltzer can than necessarily just by looking at it. In other words, when I have to look at every side of an argument, and not just that, I got to put myself in your shoes and see how are you viewing it? What was your assumption? What changed from your assumption? How is that different? That changes our comprehension. We say God guides us in the dark places. That's the Babylonian Talmud. Babylonian Talmud, and the truth is, the later development of Jewish law is also akin to that. There is this analysis and looking at every way of reading things that helps ultimately bring forth a truer understanding. That's the belief. Analysis, take it apart, break it apart, rebuild it. Someone who looks at the machine, no, take apart the machine, every bit of it, and then rebuild it. You're going to have a much better understanding, even if you have to do a blindfolded. You know, I don't know, I'm going to take my gun apart, blindfold. I don't believe the Israeli army. Maybe it's just something I used to read as a kid. But basically, you have to blindfold, take it apart, re-put it back together. You have an understanding of the thing. That's the idea, though, of the Babylonian Talmud. Okay, the other element is the Babylonian Talmud is known for serious, strong arguments and debates. Okay, so it's considered the more Talmudic, and it makes a deeper understanding. And the sugya is what we're going to do right now. We're going to take a Mishnah. We're going to do it together. We're going to pair up. We're going to pair up. We have a pair. It's perfect. We're going to pair up. I'm going to go and give you a Talmud in a second. But first, let's make sure this time I have enough time. Here we go. Stop share. Start a new share. And we get to this. Okay. Here we go. We are going to do something a little bit different today. Okay. So every one of us, we're going to analyze a law about the Shema. Everyone knows the Shema? Shema is a familiar prayer. Okay? Let's read it together. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuso L'olam Va'ed V'yahavta Eis Adonai Elohecha B'chol levavecha u'b'chol nafshecha u'b'chol me'odecha v'hayu hadvarim ha'ela asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam v'shiftecha v'veisecha u'v'lechtecha v'derech Uveshach b'chol kumecha, ukshartam laos al yadecha, v'hayu l'totafos, b'nei necha, uchasavtam, al mizuzot beisecha, uvisharecha. There are many commandments in the Shema. First of all, why do we cover our eyes? Everyone's doing it. Where did this come from? You making that up or you heard that somewhere? Right, could be, but where did she get it from? Why are all Jews doing it?
Father.
Who told him? We're gonna find out. You're gonna find out who the first person known to have done it was. But also, good, this is very good. This is what Judaism is. Judaism is my bubby told me. Bubby knows from somewhere. But wait, what's missing in the Torah? Which line did we say that's not in the Torah? Baruch Shem Kavod is not in the Torah. You look in Deuteronomy. What are you guys doing? You guys are adding to the Torah every time you say Shema. Where's this coming from? Every synagogue says it. Oh, wait, why are you saying it quietly? Where does that come from? You're saying it quietly. Where are these things from? What? Yom Kippur, you say it out loud.
Take a wild guess. The Talmud?
Hey, you don't miss a beat. Okay, here's the bigger problem. We're going to do it. We're going to analyze one word through the next 4 classes. We'll talk about other things too, but I want to take one word and show how the understanding of biblical text, biblical translation, through the oral law, through the Talmud, through the mystical, through the philosophical, are all layers of meaning of the same thing. What does the word Shema mean? Can you say, everyone else, Hero Israel? Not so simple. Not so simple. You know why? Let's take a look here. Okay? Here, right? Like it says, God heard. I'm just going to paraphrase here, but the highlighted words are in Hebrew. Those who read Hebrew could see it. He says, when Adam is hiding, he says, Shamati, I heard the sound. Well, Shema means heard. Abraham heard that Lot was kidnapped. Vayishma, Shema. But wait a second. God says to Adam, because you obeyed your wife, Yishamatu kol ishtecha. I didn't change these translations. All the Bibles are translating Shema depending on context. Hebrew has 8,000 words approximately, biblical Hebrew, as opposed to, English, which has like 175,000 words today. No one's reading the whole dictionary. Still, a couple thousand words is all you need for a good vocabulary. But in Judaism, you have, depending on context, a subtlety to the words. So Shema, when you say Shema Yisrael, what the word means is going to influence Jewish law. Because we understand there's a biblical law derived from Shema. There's a bunch of laws. Put on tefillin, put a mezuzah, and you should say these words. But wait, Shema Yisrael, if it means heard, that's one connotation. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm telling you how Talmudic law is going to think. But right now we have biblical translation. We're not sure what Shema means. You all said Hero Israel, but that's not based necessarily on looking at the whole Bible. Let's see what else it could mean. Rachel says when her surrogate gives birth to a baby, she says, God heeded my plea, Shama, listen to me. But it also means understand. When Tower babble, they will not be able to yishmu ish. So what does it mean? They won't understand. So if I read Shema as understand, it means understand, O Israel. Not listen, not heed, obey. Could mean, that's another interpretation. Or it means take to heart. God tells Abraham, I've heard your voice and I'm going to do what you said when it comes to Yishmael. Shmaticha, I heard you. How about to respond in deed? God says, Sarah says to Abraham, take my maidservant as a surrogate. And it says by Yishma Avram. Avram listened. He heeded. Didn't mean he heard. I hear you, honey. No. He did what she said. Like God tells Abraham, whatever Sarah says, Shema b'kolah, obey her. So Shema can mean obey. If your Siddur translated obey, here's the problem. If your Siddur gave every single possible translation, you'd have a 14-volume Siddur. It exists. It's called the Siddur of Kabbalists and of commentaries, There are many approaches. Or it can mean to be willing to obey, agree. When the brothers are debating about selling Joseph, so he said, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. And they listened to him. Listen here means they agreed. And the Unclus, which is one of the ancient Targumim, ancient translations, says, use the word obey. And Rashi says, whenever he gives 2 words for Shema. Shema sometimes means listen, hear with the ears, but sometimes it means agreeing with a person's statement. So in Aramaic, and look at the number 22, the kabilu, Kabbalah, to receive. He received it. So in other words, Rashi says the Unclus, the Targum, always translates Shema when it means accepting, receive, with the word receive. I received it from him means I hearkened, I accepted. Okay, so the exact same word. This is Aramaic as opposed to Hebrew, but it's an ancient biblical translation of how it's understood. Here's another one, the famous one. When the Jews stand at Mount Sinai, they say to God, Naaseh, we will do, v'nishma, and we will hear. How do you do before you hear? How do you know what to do? They say, God, whatever you say, we'll do, and then we'll listen. What are you, nuts? How are you gonna know what to do? It's like the kid, I got it, Ma, I got it. I have kids like that, I got it. We didn't tell you what we need you to do, I got it. You got to stick to the 13 commandments, the thousands of laws. How are you gonna do it before he tells you? Because nishma doesn't mean I'll do. It means I will do, and I will study, and we'll see, or obey. How can you do and obey? What does that mean? So we find that the word Shema can also mean to study or to understand, like Solomon prays for Leiv Shomea, an understanding heart. If Shema means that, it means understand, O Israel, or accept upon yourself, O Israel, or hear, O Israel. All these things can mean. Okay, so there's also other ones, but they're less relevant. Here we go straight into, let me read, these things are not the part we're going to analyze yet, but they're relevant for what we started discussing. So in the Mishnah, it says there were 6 things that the Jewish residents of Jericho did contrary to common practice. 3 of them, the sages reprimanded them, and 3 they did not. And one of the things they did, they bundled the Shema. There's a debate what bundling the Shema means. I cut out the debate because it's not important for us right now. One interpretation is, Rabbi Yehuda says they would not say, blessed be the name, his glorious kingdom forever and ever. And the rabbis were not happy with it, with the people of Jericho. There were things that they did they followed their own customs. They weren't happy because they liked this custom. So now we have a question, where does this custom come from? A total agadah, a total medrash, a story that's not in the biblical text, but that is a tradition that was transmitted, even though the Talmud here says Reish Lakish interpreted homiletically. Maimonides says here that this is one of these traditions. He says, here goes. What is the reason we say Baruch Shem Kavod Machusolo Lam Va'ed? It does not appear in the Torah. So the Gemara says, what happened was when Jacob was on his deathbed, it says he gathered them to tell them what would happen at the end of days. And then he doesn't tell them about the end of days. He tells them of blessings. What happened here? So the Talmud has a tradition that Jacob lost his prophecy because God did not want him to tell about the Messiah when it would come. So what happens? He thinks it must be because he thinks, hey, Abraham had a bad son, Ishmael. Isaac had a bad son, my brother Esau. Maybe my kids are not worthy, and that's why God hid himself from me. I no longer have prophecy. I was about to say prophecy, now it left me. Maybe there are no one of Ruvain or Yehuda, they've done some bad things. Maybe they hadn't fully repented. And all the brothers together say, Shema Yisrael. This is a rabbinic story tradition. Listen, O Israel, because Jacob's name was Israel in the text there. Shema Yisrael. Listen, O Israel, our father. Hashem Elokeinu. God is our God. Hashem is Chad. Hashem is one. We are not Ishmael. We're not Esav. We're all united in serving God. And what does Jacob say? Thank God. Baruch Shem Kavod Machusalo Lam Va'ed. Bless your name, the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. Amen, sister. This is what Jacob says. So the Talmud says what happened. Let's skim down here. So Talmud says, should we say it or should we not say it? Moses did not say it, but Jacob did say it. Let us say it and do it quietly. That's why we say it quietly. But wait, why do we compromise? We're compromise. Wait, Jonathan had a question where he mentioned Yom Kippur, we say it out loud. Here's another story which influences Jewish law. These are stories. These are not typical law. This is more custom. Okay, this is not a rabbinic ordination. It's rabbinic custom saying Baruch Shem. And every Jew does it. This is all part of our Judaism. If you're cutting that, you're cutting what our tradition. What's this other story? When Moses goes up to heaven, he hears the angels praising God with blessed be the name, the glory of his kingdom forever and ever. He said, I like that. And he brings it down. Moses teaches the Jews this. And the Talmud said, what is this comparable to? Someone steals from the king a diamond necklace. He gives it to his wife. This is hot merchandise, honey. Don't walk outside with it. Don't let the angels see that you're saying Baruch Shem. But on Yom Kippur, we're all like angels. Ha! Goodbye, angels. I'm an angel too. So we say Baruch Shem out loud. These customs today that people do are based on stories recorded 1,700 years ago, 1,600 years ago, from what they had from their past going back. And this is a little custom. Okay, but now we'll get to law. Here's the big question. This is the nexus of law and spirit. We started talking in the beginning that you have the 5 books of Moses and then you have the prophets. 5 books of Moses is law, prophets is inspiration and things like that, primarily. Hope in the future, God's providence, Mashiach, reward and punishment. And then you have, in the Talmud, you have halachic medrash, or the medrash, you have halachic law, and you have stories. One is the spirit and one is the law. Where do they meet, spirit and law together? In intention. Kavanah. How much intention do you have when doing a mitzvah? And how much matters? Here's the question. The Hebrew word kavanah means focus, direction. If you aimed an arrow in the biblical words, kivun, it means in a direction. Kavanah means to aim in a certain direction. That's what kavanah means, to aim and to direct. So here's the question. How much matters? It depends for what. The laws of Shabbos, but matzah, Passover. We're going to learn about the Shema. Right, I'm throwing out something to you. Depending on what Shema means, that's going to influence the interpretation of what you have to have in mind. If Shema means here, you're going to understand one thing. If Shema means understand, you got to do the minimum. If it means accept upon yourself, that's going to mean something else. All right, so I'm going to pass out a Talmudic page to everyone, and then you guys are going to do it with each other, the discussion. Okay, so, oh, wow, it did it here. Everyone gets 2 pages. There's 2 here in each one. You keep one color, one black and white. Okay? This is it. We're going to do the real thing here. Take 2 pages and pass it down. So you should have 2 pages each, a color and a black and white. You should have one. You have 2? No, I don't need. I made enough. All right, afterwards. Okay. There's a color and a black and white. You should have both. Okay, maybe you should have some extra ones. How many do you have there? I'll take it after you're done. She has right there. Okay. No, he has. That's for you. You got it. You're set. Okay. Good. Everyone has. You got your 2 copies. Perfect. Okay. I'm going to show you first the Mishnah. Okay. First, I'm sorry. Take a look at the Hebrew copy I gave you before. Remember I gave you a Hebrew copy with a page of Talmud on it? Yeah. Take a look at that. The one line highlighted for the bottom of the page.
Yeah.
That one line is this page of Gemara from here down. That one line is this. It's written short. Okay, I'll show you on the screen for a moment. Look at the screen. Okay, the Mishnah is the first 2 lines. I'm going to show you in a second here. Here we go. Okay, take a look. This is the 2 lines of Gemara that we're analyzing on this whole page, because we need to have Rashi to make sense of it, but we're going to see, you're going to have a statement, a rejection, a question, and then another rejection. So here's how it goes, okay? I'm just getting the right place. All right, here's the Mishnah. Let's study together the Mishnah. The analysis you guys are going to do on your own, but I want to do the studying together. I like to be the teacher for the studying, but for the analysis, you guys are going to study in partners. Okay, here goes. The Mishnah says like this. One who is reading sections of the Torah, which comprise Shema. So you're reading a Torah scroll, and in the morning, and the time of Shema is up to from sunrise until 3 hours in. Okay, that's called the morning. When it says you should say Shema when you awake, we mean the time when normal people awake until the princes are waking up, the retirees are waking up. And then we have at nighttime, there's a special time to light it. You're to read it. You're right now in the morning, you're reading Torah scroll. Oh, it's time for Shema. The time for the recitation in the morning or evening Shema arrives. If he focused his heart in Kavan Libo, if he focused his heart, he fulfilled his obligation and need not repeat Shema in order to fulfill his obligation. A guy who's reading Torah, time of Shema comes, he didn't pull out a prayer book, he just thought, okay, Shema. Now we are going to analyze, what does it mean, focused his heart? What does this mean, kavanah? What does this mean, intent? And how much intent is needed? All right, so we start with, so the Gemara, we learned in the Mishnah that one must focus his heart while reading the portion of Shema in order to fulfill his obligation. We did not say what focus your heart means. From here, the Gemara seeks to conclude. So the yellow, you look on the screen above, I just want to show you so you get an idea. In other words, that yellow is the line, this paragraph, okay? Learn from this that mitzvot require intent. Derived from this Mishnah, we're now expanding this one little law about Shema to a general principle that all mitzvahs need intent. This is a big question. How much of Judaism, if a mitzvah is a commandment from God, is the main thing that I do it? And how important is it that I know that I'm doing a commandment? I did it. I meet a guy on the street, he says, excuse me, sir, can I take your blood pressure? I put on tefillin, wrap it up quickly, and say, you're healthy. Did he do a mitzvah? But Marty says, no, we're going to look and analyze this and see, it really depends what is going on here, but we're trying to extrapolate from Shema first. And we have to see if even this case is a good extrapolation. This case may not even be a good extrapolation. First, let's see, attempt to extrapolate. Why? What do we say? He has to focus his heart, right? And if he focuses his heart, it's good. Okay. Excuse me. Learn from this, the Talmud says, that mitzvot require intent. When one performs a mitzvah, he must intend to fulfill his obligation. If he lacks that intention, he does not fulfill his obligation. Marty agrees with that. The Talmud is trying to prove it from this story. With that statement, the Gemara hopes to resolve an issue that's raised several times throughout the Talmud. The Gemara says, you have no proof. You have no proof. What do you mean? When the Mishnah said, if he focuses his heart, it doesn't mean that he had to meditate and think, I'm doing a commandment of God. It means that he focused on reading. Talmud says, what are you talking about? We have to act this out, okay? I'm going to say the halacha. You're going to reject the conclusion, and you are going to attack his opinion. Here we go. I say, from this Mishnah, which says that if he focuses his heart, that he fulfills his obligation, that proves to Marty's delight that mitzvahs need intent. You cannot just do a mitzvah without realizing you're doing a commandment. What do you say?
Not necessarily.
Why?
Well, I don't know what the intent truly means.
Right.
And so
What could it mean according to them, even though we don't know what that means yet?
Yeah.
What could it mean?
It would mean that I just
Intent?
need to open something in my mind or in the book, in a book and then read it.
Oh, the Mishnah, the Talmud is saying, could be intent means intent to read.
That's right.
Okay, we're going to come back to this intent to read in a second. You reject that.
I reject that because why are you limiting yourself just to the intent to read? Why are you limiting it?
Oh, wait, no, read what the Talmud says. Read the red one. The Gemara, you were good, but read the red one. The Gemara attacks this explanation. The pink, the red.
Oh, how
Read.
can you say that it means one must have intention to read? Isn't he already reading?
He's already reading. What do you mean intention to read? Keep on going.
The case in the Mishnah refers to a person who's reading from the Torah. Therefore, focus his heart must refer to the intention to perform it.
In other words, you're saying, what are you talking about, Dr. Levchenko? Because Dr. Levchenko didn't finish his sentence because I interrupted him. He said it meant intention to read. So now Dr. Levchenko is going to defend his rejection of my assumption. I had an assumption. He rejected it. He asked a question on that rejection. And now he's going to come back and give me the death blow of why there's no proof from this text. Read it for us.
Perhaps the Mishnah speaks of one who is reading the Torah not for the purpose of reciting the words, but in order to amend mistakes in the text. Therefore, if he focused his heart and intended to read the words and not merely amend the text, he fulfills his obligation. He need not have the intention to fulfill his obligation.
All this commentary, the bold on the text is the Gemara. The commentary is taken from Rashi or from Steinsaltz, who takes it from Rashi. So here goes the key idea here. We are saying the guy has two texts. Remember, we learned in the first class about how do you make sure your Torah scroll is correct. You have to compare it to another. When you're comparing it to another, how do you compare it? I look at one, and I might be moving my lips, I might not. I'm looking back and forth. If I'm moving my lips, I'm mumbling. I'm not even aware I'm reading because I'm not intending to read. I'm intending. So the Talmud goes and takes this Mishnah and says, who says it's a broad case that will make Marty happy that says you need intent? Maybe it's a very narrow law that's talking about a guy who's reading a Torah scroll because he's correcting his other one, and he doesn't intend to read. He doesn't intend to read. He's intending to check. So the Mishnah says, if he intended to read, then he fulfills his obligation. So what is the level of intention that is needed according to this possible last explanation? Intention to do what? To enunciate. In other words, you have to understand what you're doing? No. You have to know what translation you're saying? No. You have to be accepting anything in your heart? No. Of course, it's better to understand what you're saying. Of course, it's better to be filled with love and passion when you say the Shema. Of course, it's better to know what every word means and all the Kabbalistic meanings. Of course, it's good to take upon yourself the Shema in a serious way. But if you didn't, did you fulfill your obligation? According to our conclusion here, we have no proof that you need anything more than intent to enunciate. So now what we have here is one line of Gemara that is telling us we're starting a journey about intent. Now, I want to just do one more layer. The layer is like this. If you look at the Talmudic page in the Hebrew.
Wait a second, what intent to enunciate versus enunciate?
Correct, because this guy's mumbling. He's looking at it.
So he's not enunciating. but
Okay, but he's not mumbling. He's reading. He's reading, he's not intending to read. If I'm checking the text, you weren't here for the first class.
Well,
I'm on. I want to check the two Torahs to make sure it was written correctly.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at this one, looking at this one. I'm not intending to read, but I'm moving my lips and maybe sounds come out. I'm really intending to check. The job of checking a Torah scroll is not a job of reading. It's eyeballing to make sure it's written.
Right.
You might be moving your lips, but you're not
So
thinking you're even reading.
intent
To read.
verify.
You're tending to, so right, you were verifying.
Yeah.
But if you realize, oh, it's Shema time, let me read it out loud, and you intended to read, even though you might have been mumbling, in other words, if I was just reading to myself, but not thinking to read, in other words, it's a very low level of intent. I was trying to just analyze the text, right? And the time of Shema came, and I did not think of Shema. And then I missed the whole Shema time. Did I miss the mitzvah? According to this, I did, if I did not think for a moment, oh, I want to read this. I don't want to just eyeball it. You might have been reading it, but it was inadvertent.
Maybe I'm oversimplifying that, because I'm just confused between intent to enunciate and enunciate.
Right. So here's the thing.
For
You
mitzvah, if you enunciate.
no, that's what we're saying here. You need at least the minimum intent. The minimum interpretation of this Mishnah is you have to intend to enunciate. You can't just be
Even
talking.
if I don't enunciate the whole thing, if I intend.
No, you need both intent and enunciate.
Oh.
You need to have both. You need intent. Everyone agrees you have to say the words. The question becomes, what level of intention is needed? This Mishnah implies our conclusion of a Talmudic line that we did implies that there has to be a minimum, not of thinking of that you're saying doing a mitzvah, not of thinking that you're accepting upon yourself God as king, but the minimum is needed that you have to intend to read and read.
So that's why memorizing is not good.
Well, you could say Shema by heart. Shema is allowed to say by heart, but no. The point of it is, hold on. You're looking at two texts. I'm looking at two texts. I'm trying to see if they're correct. I'm back and forth. I might be moving my lips. I don't even know. I'm not conscious I'm reading. You have to be conscious that you're reading and intend to read to fulfill Shema. That's what we're saying here, according to the way Rashi read this. Yes,
Focusing one's heart. is
Yes.
not simply articulating words.
well, that's a debate. We don't know what the limit of focusing one's heart is. We don't know. You have a good opinion because in other places, we're going to imply that, and we're going to come to that. But right now, from this text, there's no proof that your expanded and Marty's expanded version of intent is true. You're going to have to prove it to me that you need to have intent to understand, intent or whatever layer. We're now saying it could mean the most minimal layer of intent. Now, I really bit off a little more. Okay, so I don't want to get deeper. I don't want to get deeper. So I want to go. Okay, wait. So the next one we more. I'm going to leave the analysis for later.
Can you pick the simple Gemara?
So wait, yeah. So let's go down a little bit. So here's the thing. I'm going to ask the question again, and then you'll see how it develops. The simple understanding of this text is that the minimal amount you have to focus on is intent to read it. Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's good. But wait, now look at this. Okay, let me skip this. We're not going to read the other side of the page right now because basically the analysis goes further with the next generation. But let's leave it aside. Okay, let's skip the questions. Okay, here it goes. Can everyone see this? If not, I'm going to read out loud. We have another Talmudic. This is going to expand the conversation. It says, what language can the Shema be said in? What language? Can I say, "Hero is the Lord God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord God with all your heart, all your soul"? Am I allowed to do that? So Shema, we have an argument here. Shema, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince says, has to be said in Hebrew. And the rabbis say, Shema can be said in any language. With majority opinion, rabbis, whenever it's rabbis, the law is like that. This is in a brisa, which is a form of the oral tradition, like the Mishnah. It's not in the Mishnah, though. Rabbi Yehuda the Prince says, has to be said in Hebrew. The rabbis say, it can be said in any language. The Talmud wants to know, where do they get this from? Talmud asks, what's the reason for Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? He says, because in the Shema, we say, these words which I command you shall be upon your heart. The Hebrew word v'hayu, and they will be on your heart, and they should be on your heart, means specifically these words. Don't switch them around with other words in Chinese or Greek or English. It has to be in Hebrew. Now, this is not the law. This is no Shema. The Bible is all Hebrew. Shema, the Bible is all Hebrew. 5 books of Moses, all Hebrew. Oh, hold on. Along comes Barbara. As my teacher used to say, if you were centuries earlier, your opinion would have been recorded in the book. You're just an accident of birth. Rabbi Barbara says, that's true. We'll have to discuss reincarnation. That's the next course, is reincarnation and all the other stuff. But this is very important. We're right now, though, analyzing biblical text. You brought up another biblical text, hero, understand, here. But we didn't quote that one yet. All we quoted these words. Now we say, wait, we're wondering what the minority opinion's logic is. Why do they say it has to be Hebrew? And we answered, because these words, specifically these words. And then we say, the Gemara says, wait, what's the reason why the rabbis say what they say? Because they understand it says Shema Yisrael. Well, you know what Shema means? It doesn't mean here. If it means here, then if you hear it, doesn't matter what language it's in. They don't understand here as here. You know what they understand here as? They say it means understand. Oh, Israel, understand. Now, if you don't understand, you didn't do Shema. In other words, Shema the word Shema means understand. So wait, we have a conflict now of 2 biblical verses. These words should be upon your heart. Come into a boxing ring with the word Shema, which you understand to mean understand. How do you reconcile it? So the Gemara says, how does each one contend with the other one's source? Are you with me?
Yeah, but the rabbis are always arguing about everything.
No, this is not how you learn Talmud, Barbara. You just took the shortcut. That is the short answer. No. But here what you're going to see, what's going to come out from this discussion later on, will come out incredible spiritual truths about what Shema is all about and what it means to truly listen. In other words, we start with the legal, and the legal has tremendous ramifications, but we will see how these threads get woven into many other parts of life. Right now, we're arguing with a simple question, 2 biblical texts, How does the other rabbi deal with it? They're not throwing out biblical texts willy-nilly. There has to be consistency of biblical interpretation. So how is the minority opinion going to deal with the word Shema, mean understand? And how will the majority opinion deal with these words? So the Gemara says, according to Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, doesn't it say Hero Israel? He says, no. He says Hero Israel means you have to hear it, which means you can't say it silently. Hero Israel tells you it has to be audible. In other words, it's not about understanding. Now, by the way, this is a law that's accepted by everybody. Everyone agrees the Shema has to say that you have to hear it. But 1 second. The rabbis can't use the same word Shema for understand and hear. It means one or the other when it comes to law. Either it means understand, which means any language you want, or it means hear, which means it has to be audible. So now, where the rabbis going to know that Shema has to be done audibly? They already used up the word Shema. How are they going to deal with that? So from where do the rabbis know the Shema has to be audibly? They don't understand that since I'm sorry, they do not accept that interpretation of the word Shema means here. They say you could say Shema quietly. They argue, in other words, we have two arguments now. We've just developed a new argument based on extrapolation. Does the Shema, can I go and read the Shema like this? I moved my lips. Do I have to say it out loud? Jonathan went to a show where they weren't saying Shema out loud, and he protested to me. But the first line, at least you should, minimal. Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, you have to hear with your ears. The rabbis say, you don't have to hear with your ears. You don't have to. You fulfilled your obligation. As Marty pointed out, of course, it's better to do things audibly, concentration, all these other values, but we're not talking now about what's better. We're talking about bare minimum. See, here's the thing. Once we analyze bare minimum, we can then extrapolate to new things. We have just discovered a new law here. The new law is that the rabbis hold Shema does not have to be said audibly. I have to retract my statement what the law is because the rabbis are usually going to be the law like the majority. So it may very well be, when I look next week, about does the Shema have to be said audibly? I know it's ideal, but seemingly it's not going to be necessary. 1 second. But how do the rabbis deal with the words and it will be on your heart? How do they deal with that? So they say that we have a law. You're not supposed to say the Shema out of order. Read some verses, then go back. It should be in order. So B'hayu Advarim is not, it's the order of the words, not the exact words. These words should be upon your heart in this order. Where does the Prince know that from? We go back. He says, how do you know you shouldn't do Shema out of order? Because it says the extra ha Dvarim, the words, the extra hey. So we can analyze this more, but I would just say like this. Let me ask the rabbis, how do you know? What do you do with that extra hey? They say we don't worry about extra hey. The extra hey, we don't. In other words, there are rules of interpretation. I'm not obligated to interpret every S in the Torah, every ha in the Torah. Shema, I better be able to interpret. It means something legally. It has a legal definition. According to the rabbis, the definition is understand. But we're not done yet. We're not done because, okay, here we go. The last part. There's a bunch of other debate. Here goes. The sages taught in another Braita that someone says Shema and says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord of God, the Lord is one. Intent of the heart is only required to this point. 1 second. This is the same Rameir. Rava said, Allah is like Rameir. Here, intent of the heart can't mean the same thing as intent of the heart of the Mishnah. In the Mishnah, we were talking about, we said, if you had intent, you fulfilled your obligation, right? Here we're saying that it's only the first line that needs to have intent. What is special about the first line? We're going to discover, when we look at the codes, that the core of Shema is not just Hear, O Israel, it's a commitment to obey God. Remember those earlier interpretations? If it's a commitment to obey God, you have to know, you have to be conscious of accepting the yoke of heaven. If you are not committing to follow God, you haven't done Shema. According to Rabbi Meir, the first line is Shema. The rest is Shema. You don't have to have the same level of intent. The first line is not, here goes, it's not intent to fulfill a commandment. That's a different ballpark. We don't have a conclusion with every commandment. If I can go put tefillin on somebody when he's not ready and tell him I'm taking his blood pressure. We don't have a conclusion. The Shema is unique. You know why the Shema is unique? Shema is not a regular mitzvah. It's a mitzvah of the mind and heart. It's a mitzvah that I am accepting the yoke of heaven upon myself. which means I am agreeing to keep the commandments. Hear, O Israel, listen up, Israel, understand Israel, accept Israel to keep God as your God. Am I accepting God as my God? If I don't think I'm accepting God as my God, I have not done the mitzvah of the Shema, of the first line of Shema. Because Shema, there's two commandments going on here. There's a commandment to articulate these words where intent matters less. But it's a second commandment, accept God as your God. You have not done that commandment, which is intrinsic in the first line of Shema, unless you thought, I accept God as my God. So the law we're going to see, the law about Shema is if you did not have intent, you have to go back and read it. Because it is intrinsic, when I say the law, in the codes of Jewish law that we're going to discuss next week. It becomes enshrined and accepted. That line of Shema has to be understood. Not just, so focus, I'm going to give you 6 different interpretations of what it means kavanah, and then we'll close with this. In other words, I touched on it before, but I just want to go back. Oh, here we go. Intent. These are different. I'm making it a little bit larger so everyone can see. Different word, because this is what Elias was saying as well. How do you pronounce your name? Elias? Elias. So intent of the heart, okay? Intent of the heart can mean a few, kavanah. What do we mean when we say intent? What is mindfulness, intentionality, unaware as opposed to aware, conscious, attention, focus, concentration, devotion? These are all words that mean intent of the heart to some degree. So what we're saying is the higher level of intent, which means you have to be aware not just of what your word is saying, but what you're doing. I'm accepting God as my God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. I have to know what I'm saying. Because the rest of the Shema, I might just have, we don't have a conclusion for the rest of the Shema. Do I have to intend to read? In other words, that whole Mishnah then, we're going to read it together. Well, that Mishnah is not saying that you don't have to intend. They're not talking about the first line. They're talking about the whole Shema. The first line has a unique law, different from all the rest of Shema, because the first line is not a mitzvah of articulating certain biblical words. So is there a mitzvah every day to articulate the words of Shema? Yes. Yes, there is a mitzvah to articulate the words of Shema. But there's a second mitzvah, which is what? Accept God as your God. I am the Lord your God, of the first 10 commandments we're supposed to do every day. And that is equivalent to the Shema. Yes, doctor.
Question, so when we were discussing this, the idea was that it may translate all the different mitzvot.
Not in law.
So, but what you're talking about is specifically for that first line, or should we still conclude for other mitzvot that it's okay to have a lower level of intent?
We have 5 other cases, which I have a bigger eyes than I should. I brought down other cases, but we will do it next week in the law section. If I walk by and I hear someone blowing shofar, and I did not intend, did I hear the shofar? How about if I thought he was a braying donkey? I didn't think it was a person. And then someone said, oh, that was a shofar. How about if the Persians kidnapped me and put matzah in my mouth? Did I fulfill my obligation? If someone forced me, or I didn't know it was Passover, did I fulfill my obligation? How about if I, here's another good one. Shofar, lulav, matzah. These are prayer. How about if did I pray? Wait, oh my God. I just did the whole prayers. I wasn't even focused. I was busy trading my stocks in the market in my head. The whole Amida went by. I didn't even know I was talking to God. Wait, what's the bare minimum needed for each one of these things? We're going to look at one of the codifiers who differentiates. And then the commentaries have to decide, why is there a differentiation? What's the difference between something you have pleasure from, if they eating matzah? There's difference in laws. What's the difference between the first line of the Shema, the rest of the Shema, prayer, shofar, what, in other words, I heard it. I didn't know what I was hearing. I listened to it. It was interesting. How about, in Russia, there was a story in the Soviet Union. There was a famous concert where they sounded the shofar as part of the concert. People should hear the shofar in Rosh Hashanah. You've heard that story, right? So it's a famous story. So if people didn't know, does it count? Now, if the people knew what they were listening to, they fulfilled up, and the blower knew what he was doing, and it was kosher sound. Yeah, so the story basically is, I think it was they allowed, the story, maybe you'll share the story. You remember? Basically, there's some element where the American concert musicians are coming, and it was Rosh Hashanah time. So they, in the middle of all these instruments, they played the wind instrument. They stopped for a solo from this wind horn called the shofar. And that way, all the Jews in the audience heard shofar in the middle of the communist regime. But otherwise, they would have been afraid to go to shul if they were younger people with jobs and things like that. The point is, though, if you heard that shofar there, it wasn't mixed with a violin, it was a solo. But if I didn't intend to fulfill my obligation, did I fulfill my obligation? All these things matter. Now, the reason why this is so important, because really it gets to the crux of religion, intent. Because Judaism is a Judaism of law and behavior. But we also want, like Barbara is cheering for, meaning, passion, relevance. How do we deal with both? I'll just one interesting one. If I lose money, if I drop my wallet, I dropped $10, and a poor man takes it and gets it, I have done charity. No intent, against my will, as long as I say,
That's okay.
I've done charity. What does that mean? In other words, where does intent, the intent in each case will be different. But there's no question for the ultimate religious act. Yes,
There was somebody in the parking lot who was asking for, for money. And I gave them some money and they're like refugees, whatever. And they said, and I asked like, do you need some clothes and stuff? They're like, yeah, we need blankets and clothes. So I went back home, I got some blankets and some clothes. I came back, they were not there.
right.
Doesn't mean I did.
Oh, very good. Intent without the deed, this is a big question. Intent separated from deed, how does that work? So one understanding is that any good intention, God considers it as if you did it. And one of the understandings is that sometimes we do without feeling, without intent. God links them together. God says, okay, here you intended. Another time, someone was harassing you to give a quarter. You didn't want to, and you gave it. So God links the good intent with the deed without intent, so to speak. There are different takes on this, but there's no question intent is the core of religious behavior, because what am I doing here? Am I doing it because my parents told me to do it? My grandparents told me? Do I care? Wait, if I'm doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, does it have value? There's no question in Judaism, I don't say no question. We're going to explore this. I would say, I would give you the end result. There is something to be said for doing the right thing, even for the wrong reasons, as opposed to not doing the right thing because you don't yet have, exactly.
That what you're gonna do.
Yeah, if I'm not passionate about charity, right, so this is, so Barbara, I'm telling you, we're gonna have, this is it. This is exactly the tension.
Without my wallet, because I don't know whether they're really destitute or not, and I don't want to take the risk that, maybe.
Right, but you're also saying, even if I don't feel like doing it, sometimes something is right to do. That's what responsibility and obligation means. In Judaism, if I say I have an obligation to serve God, but I'm not in the mood today, that's not serving. Serving means when I'm not in the mood. On the other hand, to serve and not want to do it is pretty embarrassing. It's not much of a relationship, which is what we spoke about in our earlier course, this tension. Good.